Of all the men who ran the Third Reich, only one stood up at Nuremberg and said the words, "I am guilty," and only one walked out of prison to become a best-selling author the world was happy to forgive. But Albert Speer wasn't the opposite of every other Nazi because he was the decent one. He was the opposite because he's the only one who got away with it. And the good Nazi the world fell for was the most successful lie the entire Reich ever told. To understand how that lie worked, you have to start with the thing it was built to hide. It was supposed to be the harmless one, the artist who wandered into a room full of killers and never quite belonged there. That was the story, and for decades it held. Albert Speer was born in Mannheim in 1905 into a comfortable, upper-middle-class family of architects. He trained as an architect himself, and by every account he was a gifted one. Then, in 1930, he went to hear Hitler speak in Berlin, and something in him shifted. He joined the Nazi Party in January 1931. The biographer Gitta Sereni, who spent years interviewing him, came away believing he was drawn in less by deep political conviction than by ambition and by aesthetics, by the sheer scale of what the movement promised a young designer who wanted to build big. And build big he did. He gave the regime the Cathedral of Light, that vast cage of searchlights pointed straight up into the night sky over the Nuremberg rallies. He drew up Germania, Hitler's fever dream of a rebuilt Berlin, with a domed hall so enormous it would have swallowed whole cathedrals. This is the soil the myth grew in. He was just an artist. He just made beautiful, terrible things for a man he admired. How guilty can a draftsman really be? But in February 1942, the answer changed overnight. Fritz Todt, the Reich's Armaments Minister, died in a plane crash. Within hours, Hitler handed the entire German war economy to the architect, and the moment Speer took that job, just an architect stopped being a thing anyone could honestly say about him. What he built next wasn't a building. It was a system that turned human beings into output, and it worked terrifyingly well. Under Speer, German armaments production didn't collapse the way it should have. It climbed. In key categories, it roughly doubled: tanks, aircraft, ammunition. And it did this while Allied bombers were flattening the factories making it. To the regime, it looked like a miracle. To Speer's later admirers, it looked like proof he was a brilliant, apolitical manager who simply got things done. But you cannot talk about that output without talking about its fuel, and its fuel was people. The armaments empire Speer ran was sustained by forced and slave labour on a scale that is genuinely hard to hold in your head. Historians put the number of forced labourers across the German war economy in the millions, with hundreds of thousands of them concentration camp prisoners. They were worked beyond exhaustion, starved and replaced. Speer's sector was the single largest consumer of that labour in the country. And there is a colder point underneath even that. Many historians argue that the production increase Speer oversaw measurably prolonged the war, that the Reich was able to fight on for months it should never have had. Which means the miracle has a cost written into it that no production graph shows. It is counted in the additional dead of the war's final stretch, soldiers and civilians, on every side. The apolitical technocrat was, in plain terms, running one of the largest forced labour operations in human history. Which raises the question the rest of his life was built to avoid. How close did this man actually stand to the killing itself? If you want the version of that story the documentary's quietly sanded down, subscribe, because it only gets worse the closer you look. The answer is written in his ministry's own paperwork, and once you've seen it, you can never go back to he just built things. By 1943, the machinery of mass murder needed materials: concrete, brick, steel, to expand. Wartime records describe the special role assigned to Auschwitz in what the regime called the Jewish question, and the camp was growing fast, precisely as the killing accelerated. The building materials and the steel that allowed that expansion came through the ministry Speer ran. According to wartime documents later reported by researchers, one delivery alone ran to around 1,000 tons of steel, and the same records line that figure up against the hundreds of people being gassed there on a single day. Himmler's office sent a written note of thanks for the cooperation. Sit with that for a second. Not a speech, not a rally. A polite, bureaucratic thank you, on paper, for helping supply a death camp. Speer's signature is inside the economy of the killing. He didn't pull a trigger or open a valve, but the place could not have grown the way it did without the resources his office moved. So the obvious question becomes the one his entire life after the war was designed to answer. How does a man standing this deep in it walk out of a courtroom with 20 years and, eventually, a book deal? The answer is that he gave the single greatest performance of his life in the one room where it mattered most. At Nuremberg, from November 1945 to October 1946, Speer did something none of the other major defendants would do. He accepted collective responsibility. He stood up and said that the leadership of the regime, himself included, bore guilt for what had been done. A sentence so unexpected from that doc that it stunned the courtroom. And then, in almost the same breath, he denied personal knowledge of the Holocaust itself. He took the blame for the whole and pleaded ignorance of the specific. It was a brilliant move, and it was a lie. He wept when the films from the camps were played. He told the court he had secretly planned to assassinate Hitler late in the war by feeding poison gas into the bunker's air intake, a claim so convenient that his fellow defendants reportedly laughed at him in open court. Some of the prosecutors, and at least one of the judges, came away convinced he had earned the rope right alongside the others. He didn't get it. He got 20 years in Spandau prison. And here is the contrast that should never be allowed to fade. Fritz Sauckel, the man who procured the forced labourers Speer's factories, ran on, was hanged. The man who rounded up the workers died. The man whose machine consumed them lived, wrote books and grew rich. The contrite, articulate Nazi didn't just survive the reckoning. In a real sense, he was rewarded for being persuasive about his guilt. And yet, there is one thing he did that was genuinely, unambiguously true. In the last weeks of the war, Albert Speer disobeyed a direct order from Hitler, and it may have saved the country he had spent 3 years bleeding. In March 1945, with the Allies closing in, Hitler issued what became known as the Nero Decree. It commanded that Germany itself be destroyed. Bridges, factories, power stations, water supplies, everything, rather than let any of it fall into enemy hands. He wanted to leave a wasteland. Days earlier, Speer had sent Hitler a memorandum warning that the economy had only weeks of life left, and begging him not to take a step so destructive to the nation's own survival. When the decree came anyway, Speer didn't carry it out. He travelled the country countermanding it, warning officials, quietly sabotaging the demolition orders. The historian Ian Kershaw described that failure to enforce the decree as the first clear sign that Hitler's authority had started to crumble, that his word was no longer reaching the men meant to obey it. Speer's defiance very likely helped preserve the bridges and plants that West Germany would rebuild its post-war boom upon. This is the genuinely defensible act. There is no spin in it. He did a brave and decent thing. It was also issued on his 40th birthday, a small, strange detail he would never forget. And here is what matters about that one true act. It became the seed he spent the next 35 years wrapping 1,000 lies around. One real moment of conscience is exactly what makes a long con believable. Watch what he built out of it. Released from prison in 1966, Speer set out to construct the most successful thing he ever designed. And it wasn't made of stone. It was made of paper and television. In 1970, he published Inside the Third Reich, and in 1976, the Spandau Diaries. Both were bestsellers. They made him genuinely wealthy and let him live comfortably in Heidelberg, and they turned him into something the post-war world seemed desperate to have. The Nazi who said sorry. He went on talk shows. He gave interviews. He became the regime's one repentant face, the proof that even inside that horror, there had been a man who eventually saw the truth and confessed. But historians who went back to the records, Magnus Brechtken, Martin Kitchin, Matthias Schmidt among them, found that the innocence was manufactured. His own former aide, Rudolf Wolters, had quietly gone through Speer's wartime diary after the war and deleted the passages that were most incriminating. The clean version of the record was edited into existence. Speer's greatest work of architecture was never Germania. It was his own reputation, and he engineered it with the same cold competence he had once aimed at tank production. The myth, in other words, didn't simply happen to him. He built it, brick by brick, in full knowledge of what it was covering. But then a single letter surfaced, and the whole structure cracked. In his own handwriting, in private, Albert Speer admitted the one thing his entire public life had been built to deny. The letter was written in December 1971 to Hélène Gentil, the widow of a Belgian resistance leader. One of around 100 letters in a correspondence that only came to light when it was sold at auction in 2007. In it, Speer wrote that there was no doubt. He had been present when Himmler announced, on the 6th of October 1943, that all the Jews would be killed. For his entire public life, Speer had insisted on the opposite. He had told the world and the court that he left that conference before Himmler reached those words. That single claim, that he stepped out of the room before the secret was said aloud, is very likely the thing that saved his neck at Nuremberg. It was the wall between him and the gallows, and in a private letter, with nothing to gain, he knocked it down himself. He was there. He heard it. The 40-year performance of the man who didn't quite know wasn't a flawed memory or an honest confusion. He knew exactly what he had done, and he knew exactly what he was selling. He simply decided the world would buy the other version, and for most of his life, it did. None of this means the case is closed, and the honest thing is to admit where it stays open. Some questions about Speer genuinely resist a clean answer. Gitta Sereni spent years on what she called his battle with truth, and even she could never fully decide how much of his remorse was real and how much was, in her own sharper phrase, guilt worn a little too smoothly. Did he ever actually intend to assassinate Hitler with poison gas? Historians broadly dismiss the story for lack of any real evidence. The practical details never held up, and his co-defendants laughed at it for a reason. Was the armaments miracle even truly his, or was the mobilization already underway before he arrived, dressed up afterward by propaganda and then by his own memoirs? These loose ends matter, and leaving them open is exactly what separates an honest account from a myth. The record is messier than either legend wants it to be. Messier than the saint, and messier than the cartoon villain. Joachim Fest, who knew the material as well as anyone, judged the weight of evidence about what Speer truly knew to be overwhelming. But overwhelming is not the same as total, and the gaps are real. The point is that not one of those open questions resolves in his favour. They simply complicate a man who spent his life trying to look simpler and better than he was. So here, finally, is the truth the title was pointing at the whole time. Albert Speer was the opposite of every other Nazi leader, but the opposite was never better. Every other one of them got caught being exactly what they were. the screamer, the fanatic, the executioner, the thief. They were found out. Speer is the only one who convinced the world he was something else entirely and made the world grateful to believe it. That is why the good Nazi was never the exception to the regime. He was its most successful product, living proof that you could help run a slave empire, supply a death camp, and prolong a war, and still die a respected man in a comfortable house, if only you were articulate enough about your guilt. The lie didn't fail. It outlived him. And that is the part worth carrying out of this. Evil's most dangerous form isn't the one that screams at you from a podium. It's the one that learns your language, wears your manners, and sits across from you looking thoughtful and sorry. The one that learns to look exactly like us. Speer understood that better than anyone the Reich ever produced. The only question left is how many other Speers we've already forgiven without ever knowing their names. If you want more deep dives into the figures who built and survived the Third Reich, the architects, the executioners, the families left holding the name, subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss what's next here on History Hangover.